Se asustó cuando la vio seguramente en estos tiempos que vivimos. Digo, ¿qué me han puesto debajo? Les han puesto auriculares para los que quieran disfrutar de una excelentísima traducción, puedan hacerlo. Y digo esto porque me toca en este momento, tengo el gusto de presentar a Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer es fundador y presidente de Eurasia Group, el grupo Eurasia, una empresa líder mundial en investigación y consultoría de riesgo político. Es un líder de pensamiento prolífico, autor y conferenciante renombrado, que expresa regularmente su punto de vista sobre temas políticos en discursos públicos, en apariciones en televisión y en las principales publicaciones, incluyendo la revista Time, donde es el columnista de Asuntos Exteriores y editor general, como si eso fuera poco. Fue reconocido como el gurú ascendente, así lo calificaron, en el ámbito del riesgo político, se entiende, por The Economist. Dicta clases de su disciplina como profesor de investigación global en la Universidad de New York. Y su último libro es, por cierto, un éxito de ventas. Se titula Superpotencia, 3 opciones para el papel de América en el mundo. Dicho todo esto, solo me queda decir, señoras y señores, Mr. Bremmer, it is a pleasure to have you here. We're waiting for your words. I think the mic is on. So go ahead.
Are we on?
This is all yours.
Thank you, sir.
Success.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be invited back to my favorite city in South America. It's easy for me to say. I know you've been hearing a great deal about Argentina all day long. You're going to hear about the rest of the world from me. And there's no question that it is a relief to be in a country where foreign policy is not a priority and a disaster for the government. Right? I mean, you don't have to worry about a refugee crisis. You don't have failed states all over your borders. You don't have a massive terrorist threat. You don't have an arms race going on. Foreign policy feels pretty good in Argentina. Some drug trafficking, right? That's about it. But the broader global environment is becoming more challenging. And it is going to change your orientation to the rest of the world. And so I have a little bit of time with you today. I want to talk about why that is and why you should care. That's my intention. If I accomplish that, I will go away happy. 2 big things that are happening right now. The first is that for all of our lives, the largest economy in the world was an advanced industrial democracy. Since World War II, we've had an environment where the United States has driven a global free market. Americanization and globalization were the same thing, right? That is no longer true. We have had, on average, a global recession every 7 to 8 years since World War II. We have not had a single geopolitical recession until now. It is a large geopolitical recession, and the question is, will it become a geopolitical depression? The change in the world order. As I'm sure you know, my country, the United States, is about to elect a new president. I apologize. I'm sorry for the embarrassment that this has caused over the last year. It's almost over. But the fact is that the next American president will preside over a transition where the largest economy will no longer be the US, it will be China. And China, as you know, has a very different system. The Chinese today, they're writing big checks, big infrastructure they're building. Venezuela, they were the last country standing willing to invest in Venezuela. They're willing to build bridges and ports and roads, but not to support a free market. They're doing it to support bilateral Chinese influence, not multilateral global free markets. China's a poorer country. They're less focused on the global environment. They don't have rule of law. They don't have an independent judiciary. Most importantly, they are much more volatile. Now let me be clear. I'm not saying this because I don't like China. We all want China to succeed. The alternative is very bad. But the uncertainty about China in 5 and 10 years' time, can they transition to a consumer-led economy? Can they maintain a single-party political system? That is massive. So we are all now going to experience a global economy for the first time where the largest country is going to be one of the most uncertain. That will affect Argentina. That means that growth is going to be more challenging, that uncertainty will grow. It means that you need not a China policy, but an Asia policy. It means that you will have to hedge and diversify more. And yet, this is happening at the same time that the countries that you want to diversify with, I know I was just with President Macri 3 hours ago, and I know he's seeing the President of Finland today. And he told me that Argentina wants to orient more towards countries like Israel and Finland and the United States, advanced industrial economies, to balance so you have a good relationship with China and with the developed world. It makes sense. But you are trying to do that exactly at the moment that the Americans and Europeans are turning away from globalization. That those countries are saying, we don't know if we want to lead. We have the Americans saying, we don't want to be the global policeman. We don't want to be the architects of global trade. We don't want to even be the cheerleaders of global values. And so, unfortunately, Argentina now sees globalization, we need more. Efficiency, we have to get better. We have to reach out. But the timing is more challenging. So that is the first reason why foreign policy has to be higher on the agenda for Argentina in the next 5 years than it has been over the last 5. You got to do it. But there's a second reason. And the second reason is that leaders themselves are getting weaker. The heads of governments themselves are becoming less legitimate. I live in New York. I was a few weeks ago at the United Nations for the General Assembly meetings every year. And this year, almost 200 heads of government from all over the world come to New York. The traffic is horrible. But the weakest group of leaders that I've seen in decades, their ability to get things done so constrained. The lack of popularity at home. The feeling in these countries that their governments do not represent them. Now, you may think I'm talking about the US. You may think I'm talking about Europe, but before I say that, I'm talking first about the Middle East. It's worth looking at why this is happening in the Middle East so we can understand why it's happening with the US elections, why it's happening with Brexit, why it's happening to Merkel, and why eventually it will happen here. For the last 40 years, the Middle East has benefited by a United States and allies that were willing to provide security in the region, send troops, spend a lot of money, take the time. In the Middle East, you could take oil out of the ground, and it made a lot of money. OPEC had a lot of power. And even though the governments weren't very good, let's be honest, the people in those countries weren't revolting. They were relatively quiet. Now we're here in 2016, and I look at the Middle East, and I see that all three of those things are no longer true. The Americans look at Syria and Iraq and Libya and Yemen and Afghanistan, and they say, wow, those are bad things. Hope somebody does something about that, because the US doesn't want to. Much less provision of security. World's second largest economy, China. They want to fix Syria? Nope. Third largest economy, Japan. They want to fix Syria? Nope. Fourth largest economy, Germany. Merkel says, yeah, this is a big problem. I'm going to help. I'll bring in the refugees. And then she looks around, and Obama says, great. You have a party with that. Europe says, what are you doing? Merkel's opposition says, you've got to be kidding me. Her own party says, we can't do this. So the security is not there. OPEC is not there. OPEC is being destroyed. The energy revolution, we know about that in Argentina. Shale production over time will develop a lot of money and opportunity here in Argentina. Already is in my country, the United States. It will in Europe. It will in China. But what does that mean for the Middle East? Not so relevant. What does the Iran deal mean for the Middle East? Iran produces more oil. OPEC destroyed. So they can't take the money out of the ground the way they used to, and their populations are getting angry. They all have smartphones. They can communicate. They can organize. And they don't like their governments. So in the Middle East, the states themselves are starting to fall apart. They're becoming weaker, more vulnerable, fragmented. Not everywhere. Israel is stable. The UAE is very globalized, will do well. Iran over time will do better. The Kurds in northern Iraq. But that's it. Generally, the Middle East is coming apart. Now, why did I start there? Because the issue in the Middle East is that there used to be an agreement, an implied agreement, between the government and the people. You give me security, you give me money, you keep things okay for my family, you give me a future, you can govern however you want. But that's unwinding. Now let's look at Europe and the US, because it's a very similar issue. The Brits voted to leave the EU. It didn't make a lot of economic sense. It's going to take them years to negotiate that exit. They have to negotiate it with the EU, which is one of the most dysfunctional organizations on the planet. That's not going to be fun. That's going to hurt the UK. It's going to be years of uncertainty with an outcome that maybe, if we're lucky, will be about as okay as it was before. That's not smart. So why would they do that? Why would the British people, in a very close vote, why would they vote for this thing? And the point is, they were not voting for Brexit. They were voting against their leaders. They voted against the conservative leaders, against the liberal democratic leaders, against the labor leaders. They voted against their newspapers, the Financial Times. They voted against the Economist. That's wrong. I love the Economist. They voted against the intellectuals, against the bankers, against the corporate leaders. The Brits that voted for Brexit, you know who they were? They were Palestinians. Palestinians that were sick of the Israeli government, sick of the Palestinian government. There's a rock there. They pick up the rock and they throw it at some Israeli soldier. That's not going to fix anything. But it gives them a voice. It gives them agency. That's why Brexit happened. Why is Bernie Sanders doing so well? Why did he almost beat Hillary Clinton? How could Donald Trump be the nominee for the Republican Party? Who are these crazy Americans that are voting for these people? They're the same people. They're voting against the establishment. And they're doing it because for decades they feel that they have been lied to. They feel that globalization has not helped them. And so the leaders are getting weaker. The establishment is getting weaker. Now, why does this matter for Argentina? Why should you care? There are two reasons. One big reason is that it will be harder for you to trade with these countries, because they will be looking at all of these corporations and saying, we need you to be back here. There will be more protectionism. There will be more inefficient policy. Central banks will become less independent, more political. They'll be squeezed. It'll be harder on emerging markets. You will need to be more competitive. You'll need to fight harder for open markets in this environment. That's one reason. But there's a second reason that is more important. And that's because these trends are coming to you. So, globalization for the last 40 years was a fairly simple process. It was a process where emerging market labor displaced developed market labor. Labor in Mexico, in Brazil, in China, in India, in Argentina was cheaper, and as a consequence, companies became more global. The profits went to the shareholders. A lot of jobs went all over the world. And two things happened. The top 1% of the globe did really well. And the middle class in the world did really well. Now that last story is a great story. It's the best story in the history of the planet. In the last 20 years, we have taken over 1 billion people out of poverty. That's tremendous. That makes me optimistic. It should make you optimistic. But in between the 1% and the global middle class, we have the wealthy middle class in Europe and the US. And they did not do better. Even though the goods got cheaper, even though there were Walmarts all over the United States, their unemployment rates went up. Their life expectancy went down. Who's voting for Trump in the US? Undereducated white people. As a demographic, they are more incarcerated than they were in jail. They have more behavioral illnesses, and they don't live as long. In the developed world, everyone's living longer except them. Globalization has not worked for them. It's not worked for them in the UK or France or Germany or Spain or the Netherlands or Italy. That is the problem. Now here's why this matters. If the first phase of globalization is developed market labor going to emerging market labor, the second phase of globalization is emerging market labor being displaced by technology, right? All over the world. So, one of the things I do with my company is I talk to CEOs, some of the world's biggest CEOs, of all different fields, pharmaceuticals, retail, transport, infrastructure, manufacturing. I will tell you that almost every single one looks at the future. They think they can grow. They look at the future. They're prepared to expand. And they look at the future and they say, we're not going to need much labor. We're going to have much smaller workforce. That's what they say. I'll give you some examples. 2 weeks ago, I was with the CEO of Domino's Pizza. Domino's Pizza, right? He told me within 10 years, no more delivery people. All done, smaller vehicles, no drivers, automated to your door. No tipping when you get the pizza. You go downstairs, that's it. Boom. I talked to the CEO of Johnson & Johnson. They have a new factory in China. They make toothbrushes. Little micro bristles on the end of your toothbrush so you brush well. Now automated. Factory had 5,000 people a couple years ago, now 2,000. Within 5 years, a few hundred. Reid Hoffman, my friend who runs LinkedIn, says all trucking driverless within 10 years. Shipping going driverless. Financial advisors in banks moving to AI. Now, the wonderful thing is this drives efficiency. This creates wealth. There's a lot of money that's going to be made because of all of these technological advances, and they're coming now. This is not 30 years. It's not 50 years. It's now. This will happen under President Macri. This will happen under, likely, President Clinton. The people that we now see, Xi Jinping, they will be dealing with these issues. Climate change is horrible in sub-Saharan Africa. Extreme weather conditions. Climate change is horrible in the Maldives. They're going to lose their country. The islands are going to go under the water. But for most of us, climate change is 20, 30, 50 years away before it really changes our lives. But the next wave of globalization is now. We have to ask the leaders we have now, what are you doing to address this issue. Because if the emerging markets do not address it, the populism that we see now emerging in the US and Europe is coming here. There is no question. Now, what kind of a world does that create? Where are we heading given that? Because we can't stop it. We can't change it. We can't suddenly create new jobs. There will be jobs, not enough. Not fast enough. We won't reskill people fast enough. So what can we do? There are really three options. There are three things that are going to happen in the world. All three will happen. The question is the balance. It's which one will happen here? What is the weighting in the world? The first response is the good one. You create opportunity. So in Denmark, the Danish government has recognized that they will not have jobs for their population, not full-time employment. But everyone in Denmark has a skill set. Some have very advanced skills, some not so much. And they believe, and I think they're right, that the future of labor is going to be like Uber. It's going to be like Airbnb. So if you are an employee, there will be certain times of the year that your skills will be highly sought after. And you will have surge pricing. You can charge more right before Christmas. You can charge more on a vacation when other people don't want to work. But there may be months that you don't have a job. You don't have a permanent employer anymore. It's what they call a gig economy. Now, if that's the way it works, that means that you don't get your health care through the company. You get it from the government. The government invests much more in infrastructure. The effective tax rate for wealthy people goes way up. In Sweden, they're experimenting with a 30-hour work week. I hear that at Fiat in Argentina, you have a 30-hour work month. So you can get used to this. In the Singapore, they're investing heavily in digital education. They only have 6 million people, they're very rich, but they want to make sure every single one has the best chance to get a higher piece of that pie. The more that governments do that, the more capable you will be to have an inclusive society where everyone is a part, where the government has a new social contract, and your leaders are legitimate for all. That is one possibility. That's the good one. Let me look at the bad one. The bad one is what happens if your government is weak, is poor, is insecure, and doesn't know how to respond to this demand. And they ignore it. And they fall apart. And you have revolution. That is what is happening now in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. It will happen in other parts of the Middle East. I fear it will happen in Saudi Arabia. I think it's too late. The new Saudi government actually understands they need to move away from oil. They hired McKinsey to come in and do a plan for them. I read it. It's a good plan. It's too late. The Saudi educational system is too weak. The women aren't accepted in the workplace yet. All of the most productive employees come from outside of Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Lebanon. The work ethic is too poor. You know, if I were a parent and I had a kid graduate from college, comes home, doesn't want to work, sitting on the couch, and I say, you got to work and pay me rent or you're out. If the kid's 25 years old, that can work. If the kid's 50, probably doesn't work. That is what is happening in Saudi Arabia. That's going to happen in some parts of Africa. It will happen in weaker emerging markets. It might happen in Venezuela. It will happen in some countries and in some parts of countries. So I told you the good outcome. I told you the bad outcome. What about the middle? You might not like the middle. The middle is where you don't fix the social contract. You refuse to spend the money. You refuse to change things for the way the elites and the middle classes interact. It's too comfortable. The government is too controlled by special interests. The U.S. has that problem. But there's a lot of money. The social safety net is there, and the institutions are still pretty strong. You know what happens then? Inequality gets bigger, and you create walls. Now that is what happens in a lot of places. It has already happened in Israel and Palestine. The Israelis today no longer need Palestinian labor. They've walled it off. They have surveillance, cyber, human intelligence. They can shoot down missiles. So as a consequence, today, there is no longer a two-state solution. Instead, these left and right focus just on what happens inside Israel, and the Palestinians are forgotten. That's not good for Palestine. It's fine for Israel, and it's actually pretty stable. If you don't fix the social contract in the next 10 years, you will have more of that. You've got 1 million refugees in Germany. Right now, they get all of the same benefits as Germans do. Merkel's getting weaker. It's not going to work for long. If they don't integrate these people, if they don't fix this, then you will end up giving refugees and immigrants in Germany a different minimum wage. They'll live in different areas. They'll be ghettoized. I hate to say that, but that's already happening in the U.S. Not officially, unofficially. But if you look around America and you see places where the universities are no good, where they're private sector and they're predatory, look at places where no longer have the ability to effectively do their job and the violence is up. Look at places where the jails are overcrowded and they don't work. Look at places where it's not safe to be on the streets, and you see that in the United States, the world's largest economy, there are parts of America that are already getting walled off. Not physically, but virtually. That inequality is going to grow. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because we do not have a choice between these three options. They are all coming. There was the best study I've seen on this from some Oxford University scholars, said that within 10 years' time, 47% of all of the jobs in the United States are under extreme high threat of being automated. In the US. How do you respond to that? We will have all three responses. The rich countries and regions will have the best shot at the first. The poorest will have the best shot at the third. The answer is not, can we all be like Denmark? The answer is, what's the percentage? Are we mostly going to have walls? Or are we going to actually create changes for our countries? And that needs to be addressed now. In the United States, two things will happen. You've seen in the last week that Donald Trump's campaign is falling apart. I mentioned to you I expect President Clinton. I would bet you a lot of money on that. Trump is done. The Democrats will probably win the Senate. The Republicans will probably keep the House. But they'll lose seats. They'll lose moderate seats. And the House of Representatives will be more polarized. So if Hillary Clinton is president, what about Washington? I would argue that Washington is not preparing to address this issue. We're not going to see a new deal on taxes. We're not going to see a new deal on infrastructure. We're not going to see Social Security, pensions in the U.S. get fundamentally changed, or the Americans figure out how to pay for health care sustainably. None of that is going to happen. And the reason for that is because this crisis is too small to force the Americans to respond. That's the bad news. The good news is that America is actually a very decentralized country. So if Washington is broken, certain parts of America will govern. Look at the energy revolution. The U.S. is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. Not because of Obama, not because of Bush, but because of governors and mayors locally pushing through policies that created jobs. The same thing is true for legalization of marijuana. And now Colorado is making lots of money. Same-sex marriage, same thing. Moving away from the death penalty, same thing. It's local. So that means that you will see a lot of opportunity on the ground in the United States. But the inequality will grow. And the places where you do not have good local government will increasingly be forgotten. Cities will do better. Rural areas will lose their infrastructure advantage. And America as a country will become less coherent. This is a world where decentralization is important. You know, Spain still doesn't have a government. They keep voting. No government. And yet the Spanish economy is still working reasonably well. And the reason for that is because Spain has pretty good local government. Even Podemos in Spain is okay locally. Not at the national level. Not Professor Iglesias. As a political science professor, I should tell you, never elect a political science professor as your president. It's a bad idea. But locally, Spain actually works. And I think you'll see that in other countries as well. So we are going to be in an environment where national leaders will get weaker, and yet there will be opportunities both locally and in public-private partnerships, working with universities, working with billionaires, working with corporations. Global climate has been one of the biggest challenges over the past decades. President Obama says it's the biggest national concern. Whether I agree or not, we know it's important. And we saw all of these global summits in Copenhagen, in Cancun, in Durban. They all failed. Then we had one in Paris, and they did something. How did they do it? It wasn't because the central governments got together and said, okay, it's time. They did it because billionaires like Bill Gates and Jack Ma from China and a bunch of mayors including many from India and China, got together and said, our national governments are not getting it done, and so we need to. This is a world that is going to get a lot messier. It's a world where the leaders are going to be more complicated. Henry Kissinger, God bless him, 94 years old. His world is all about governments. China's rising, Cold War, building the army. He was right in the 20th century. In 2016, that's not the way it's going to look. Governments are going to share the stage, locally and with other non-state actors. And the governments that do that well will succeed. Argentina is in a good position. You produce extraordinary agriculture. You've got great tourism potential. Your immediate neighborhood looks great. Turkey wishes they could have a neighborhood like Argentina, right? A lot of things going well in Argentina, and the ability now to move towards a government that understands competitiveness and globalization is a big positive. I truly believe that Argentina has more time to get this right than many other countries in the world. You don't need to do this tomorrow. But this isn't 20 years. It's 5 to 10, which means you start planning now. And I think that every single person here who has had a conference that is focused overwhelmingly on Argentina, in future years, this conference will be more global. Because in future years, you will understand how much more this country is going to be affected, not just by Venezuela and Brazil, but actually by these technology trends that you can't stop. By what's happening in your smartphones, by what's happening in your workplaces, by what's happening in education all over the world. So to go back to what I was talking about right at the beginning, we had the global economic recession in 2008, and the G20 got together. They met and they looked around at each other. The first time the G20 heads of state were all in one place. And there was fear. There was panic. They understood that the world could go into depression. None of them wanted that. And so they all responded together. They put out a joint communique. They went back home. They invested. They stimulated their economies, not just the developed world, China too, and we got out of it. Took a while. The rebound was not as strong or as robust as we would like. The IMF will tell you global growth is still lower than it should be. But the international community responded. And as a consequence, we're in a better place. We didn't have a global depression. Now it's 8 years later, and we are sitting looking at a geopolitical recession where global leadership is eroding, where the Americans don't want to lead. No one else is doing it either. And so the question I have is, are we going to respond to ensure that we get out of this geopolitical recession over time incrementally, or does it become a geopolitical depression? Does the state order start falling apart? Does the rest of the world look more like the Middle East does today? That is the question. I don't have an answer. But I know that there is opportunity. I know that the answer is not that the 20 countries in the world are going to sit together and respond the way they did in 2008 and 2009. Because they are not aligned, they are not as powerful. Merkel is not who she was. Obama's successor is more constrained. China is willing to lead economically, but not to align with the US. Russia is willing to lead in security, but to undermine the US. So it won't be the same group of leaders that will fix this. Instead, if we fix it, it'll be because a much more creative constellation of national leaders and local leaders and private actors get together and find individual ways to dig through this problem. The challenge is becoming big enough in the next 5 and 10 years that we will focus on it. We will feel the urgency. You will feel the urgency. People will know they need to spend resources. Leaders will know they need to do something, but it will be a very different kind of response. So let me end with this point. You know, as I mentioned, the last 20 years, we have taken over 1 billion people out of poverty. In the next 10 years, the technologies that we will unleash will be vastly greater. They will produce vastly more wealth that will allow us the ability to remove global poverty from the agenda. The only reason people will be suffering in 10 years will be because of politics, not economics. That's tremendous. So the question will be, will we get the politics right? The international politics right? All of you in this room are part of the solution, and we know it's coming. So I hope that you find this not a disheartening speech, but actually an empowering one. I am deeply honored to be able to come here and talk to you about the world when the rest of the time is about Argentina. I'm going to leave the stage and then we're going to go back to Argentina again. But we have a coffee break, and if people want to come up and talk to me informally during coffee, I'm not going anywhere. I'd be delighted to say hi, and I look forward to coming back to your great country very soon. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Ian. Thank you very much, Ian. Enjoy your stay in Argentina. Disfruta tu estadía aquí. This is a very interesting country, you know for sure. Este es un país muy interesante, and its people too, y su gente también. Bueno, vamos a hacer una pausa ahora, un break, como diría Ian, y nos reencontramos en un ratito nomás. Los dejo con Paula, que da las instrucciones y algunas indicaciones relativas a lo que va a pasar inmediatamente. Gracias, continuamos en un instante. Gracias.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias, Pancho. Y así es, los invitamos a un coffee que se va a servir en el foyer y nuevamente en el Salón Catalinas, donde podrán disfrutar además de la interesante muestra sobre la celebración de los 80 años de la Cámara. Y a las 18 horas puntualmente los convocamos a este salón para seguir escuchando a los próximos invitados, que son nada más y nada menos que el panel de ministros. Nuevamente el pedido especial, por favor, de no dejar sus efectos personales en el salón. Reiteramos además el agradecimiento de la Cámara Argentina de la Construcción por el valioso aporte de las empresas y organismos que auspician la convención anual, y muy especialmente la cobertura médica de Construir Salud, puesta a disposición de la convención por la UOCRA. Recordamos que ya se han deliberado la economía argentina, nuevos desafíos para la inversión, oportunidades para el financiamiento, la Argentina y el mundo. El reencuentro a las 18 para ya entrar en la parte final de esta convención. Muchas gracias.